recorded, and I'm going ahead and hitting that record button right now. Okay, I think that takes care of all the housekeeping. What I'd like to do now is get into some of the substance of our presentation today. So if you've been paying attention to the state legislature over the past couple of years, you will have noticed that it has been a record 2 years in terms of state legislation that has to do with homeless youth. So in 2013, it was the year in the entire history, actually, of the California state legislature with the most legislation passed on related to homeless youth. And then there were additional pieces of legislation passed in 2014. So starting with 2014, there are two particular pieces of legislation that we want to make sure you're aware of. One is called AB 1733. And for those of you who maybe are not entirely familiar with the legislative process in Sacramento, bills usually will have a number that refers to whether it was introduced in the Assembly or in the Senate. So an AB means an Assembly bill, and then it will have a randomly assigned number attached to it. So for AB 1733, that's the number assigned to a bill that provides free ID cards and birth certificates to homeless people. Another piece of legislation that passed in 2014 is AB 1806. And this legislation has provisions designed to increase the graduation rates for homeless youth. So allowing them to obtain a different kind of diploma, making sure that if they're moving later in their high school career into a new school district, that they can still be allowed to graduate under the provisions of their previous school district, providing for partial credits and some other information. There's actually a lot in AB 1806. That's not our topic for today, but we will have a webinar specifically on AB 1806 in May. We'll provide you in a subsequent email. We'll go ahead and give you that link, but if you would like it, it's right here in the presentation, and you will be getting a link to this PowerPoint about 1 hour after the webinar ends. GoToTraining will send that out automatically to everyone who registered. Some of the legislation from 2013, as I mentioned, that was a record year for youth homelessness legislation. One bill, AB 346, that was a bill that was really spearheaded by the California Coalition for Youth. They've been working very busily ever since then on regulations and on the implementation of that bill. So if you have questions or would like more information on that, I really encourage you to get in touch with the California Coalition for Youth around that. AB 1006 had to do with juvenile court records and sealing some of those juvenile convictions so that they wouldn't prevent youth from being able to get employment or get other services. AB 309, this had to do with eliminating barriers to CalFresh, or SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for homeless youth. We had heard reports of a lot of youth on their own running into barriers accessing CalFresh related to really just some misunderstandings about the legal requirements related to their age, the fact that they were living separately from their parents, what the definition of a household was. So since AB 309 went into effect, there was also a national policy that went into effect just around the same time, and we've really seen a big drop in barriers faced by homeless youth in accessing that CalFresh program. And many of our county welfare offices have really done a great job in implementing that and really reaching out to involve as many homeless youth as possible in the CalFresh SNAP benefits. Another bill, AB 652, this is one again that we will have a webinar on. This webinar will be offered in January, and again, there's your link. That has to do with child abuse and neglect reporting requirements and just making it clear that being an unaccompanied minor is not in and of itself grounds to make a report. And then lastly, AB 1068. Again, this is another one that we'll have a webinar on, this time in March. And this has to do with unaccompanied homeless youth being able to consent to disclose their own education records and access those records, and also has some provisions about directory information. So again, we won't go into a lot of detail about that now, but keep your eyes open for that webinar coming up in March, and you'll be able to register for that. Let's get now into the substance of our webinar for today, which is, of course, SB 177, the Homeless Youth Education Success Act. SB 177 has a few specific requirements. I'm going to go over them all right now, and then we'll go into each of them in a little more detail. The first one is that it confers immediate residency for interscholastic sports and other extracurricular activities for homeless youth. The second one is that it provides immediate enrollment in school for homeless students, including charter schools and county offices of education. The third is a requirement to post public notice of homeless students' rights. And those of you who have been working with the McKinney-Vento Act programs for a while, these are going to sound familiar to you. And number 4, sorry, my slides keep jumping ahead on me here. Number 4 requires the California Department of Education and the California Department of Social Services to organize an interagency work group specifically on the issue of unaccompanied youth and on homeless children and youth generally, looking at developing policies and practices to support homeless children and youth and to ensure that child abuse and neglect reporting requirements do not create barriers. So now that we've seen kind of a quick overview of what the bill provides, let's get into some of the more specifics. So the number 1 had to do with interscholastic sports and other extracurricular activities. And here's the actual language of the statute if you want to take a look at the real nitty-gritty here. This was a statute that was in place for children in foster care for some time, and it did have a reference in it to homeless youth, but it was a little bit unclear. So now this particular education code section just very clearly says that a foster child who changes residences or a homeless child or youth who changes residences shall be immediately deemed to meet residency requirements for participation in interscholastic sports. So one thing I would point out is that this is specifically about residency requirements. So other requirements such as perhaps academic level, grades, attendance, obviously meeting the skill level requirements to participate in the sport, those are still all going to be in place for students who are homeless or those in foster care. This is looking at the changes in residency that can be provoked by homelessness as well as by placement in foster care, and making sure that that moving around does not create a barrier to students being able to participate in sports and other extracurricular activities. So let's see if I can make my webinar work here and get a little bit interactive with a poll. You should see a poll on your screen asking whether you've worked with homeless students who have faced some of these kinds of barriers. Everyone is invited to answer that. Obviously, you have to choose either yes or no. You can't choose both. So go ahead and take your vote in the poll, and we'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll see what you all think. Okay, it looks like most folks have voted. We'll give you just a few more seconds here to get your vote in if you haven't yet. All right, let's take a look at the results. As you can see, hopefully you're seeing this on your screen, 86% of you have not worked with students who have faced this barrier, but 14% have. So what we're hoping is that now that SB 177 is the law of the state, we'll see some of those barriers, at least certainly the ones related to residency, should be resolved. One thing that I'd like to put out there is that this is an issue that NAEHCY has been working on in different parts of the country for quite some time. Some of you may have seen the Sports Illustrated story that came out on this. I guess that was in October, I think that actually hit the newsstands. HBO is looking at doing a story as well. So if you're one of those 14% of respondents who have faced some barriers, I would really welcome for you to send me an email or a phone call. You'll see my contact information coming up on a later slide, and let me know some of the struggles that you're facing, and we'll see if we can try to work together and get some of that resolved for you and for the students. So please do feel free to get in touch with me offline if you are dealing with any of that. In the meantime, though, let's get back to our presentation. So this is not going to come as any surprise to folks who are working with schools, or really probably anyone who's worked with students. We know that activity programs, both sports and other extracurricular activities, are really great things for students to participate in. It can improve students' grades. It can certainly improve their attendance. It can keep them attached to school and really result in fewer discipline problems. We also know that these benefits are even more significant for girls and minorities. And when you compare it also to other programs designed to keep students connected to school, improve attendance, improve discipline, when we're looking at interscholastic sports and extracurricular activities, it actually has even greater benefits to socioeconomically disadvantaged students than it does for others. So these are clearly important activities for all students to participate in, and especially students who are struggling with homelessness. So that's really where I think the impetus to make sure that homeless students were clearly included in SB 177 came from. If you're familiar with the California Interscholastic Federation, or CIF, they do have processes in place to allow students to make appeals, but they also do have procedures that have for students who move during the school year to have to show a valid change of residence. And just because of the extreme mobility associated with homelessness, as well as the fact that homelessness by definition can be hard to prove. So whether or not a student has had a valid change of residence when that change of residence has been because someone has kicked them out, or they've been evicted, or they've gone from couch to couch, it can be hard to prove that that meets the CIF standards. And again, that's where SB 177 comes into play. So if a McKinney-Vento liaison is working with a student, has identified that student as meeting our definition of homeless, so they are a homeless student, then SB 177 should just automatically make them eligible under the residency requirements. There is a brief from the National Center for Homeless Education, and again, I included the link there at the very bottom of your slide. It's a really good brief about ensuring full participation in extracurricular activities for students experiencing homelessness. It's not specific to California, so you probably won't see a specific reference to SB 177 in there. But in terms of some of the other barriers that are not related to residency, that SB 177 really probably wouldn't take care of, things like fees, transportation, other barriers, that's a really good brief to take a look at to give you some strategies and thoughts for how you can maximize that participation for students you're working with who are experiencing homelessness. So that's the extracurricular activity piece of SB 177. Let's take a look now at the immediate enrollment piece. And once again, I've gone ahead and put the actual statutory language right there on the slide for you so you can see what it says. And it basically says what the bullet said. Public schools, including charter schools and county offices of education, shall immediately enroll a homeless child or youth seeking enrollment. Now, again, I know many of you on the webinar are McKinney-Vento liaisons for your districts. You're very familiar with the McKinney-Vento Act, and you're probably saying, well, duh, we've been doing this, since 2001, if not before. And hopefully that is the case. As you can see on this next slide, McKinney-Vento Act already requires immediate enrollment. Children and youth in homeless situations are eligible for immediate enrollment in any public school that students living in the same attendance area are eligible to enroll in. So again, that would include available charter schools. It would include appropriate and available programs of your county office of education. And the McKinney-Vento Act also defines the terms enroll and enrollment to include attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So you'll see that definition of enrollment actually kind of gets us back to the extracurricular activity piece of SB 177, where when we're looking at immediate enrollment, that is going to include participation in school activities. And so that fits us back into the number 1 of SB 177, as well as here on number 2. So again, the McKinney-Vento Act does say that enrollment needs to be immediate, even if the student doesn't have required documents. And you can see the such as list, so that's not an exhaustive list, but some of the most common things that students and families are required to provide to enroll in school. And McKinney-Vento, of course, is creating an exception to that. You can also see immunizations as well, that enrollment needs to be immediate. If the student doesn't have immunizations or if records are lacking, we have immediate enrollment, but then work to get the records, or if necessary, to get the immunizations taken care of as soon as possible. And that applies to other medical records and procedures as well. So you might ask yourself, if we already had this in the McKinney-Vento Act, why have a state law about it? And I think one of the clearest reasons for that is that a lot of people working in schools, at least in my personal experience, my mother was a school secretary for many, many years before she retired, and she had never heard of the McKinney-Vento Act until I started working on it and started talking to her about it. But she could have recited her school policy manual backwards and forwards, page and letter. I think a lot of times it's really unfair to expect people who are working in schools to be intimately familiar with all the federal laws that are out there. But if we bring it a little bit closer to home and we can put it in state law or even better, local policy, that's a lot more reasonable to expect people to be familiar with that. So that's some of the philosophy behind trying to put some companion requirements in state law to what really is already in place in federal law. So with that said, let's try another poll. What do you think about SB 177 in terms of its requirement for immediate enrollment? Do you think that having this state law in place has increased awareness and maybe even compliance in your own community or in your own school district with these requirements? Feel free to be honest. I think you know what answer I'm hoping for, but we really do want to get your honest feedback on this. So I see you all voting. Okay, I can see that most people have voted, so we'll just wait a couple more seconds and give the last few folks a chance to vote. All right, that's just about everybody. I'm going to close the poll and let's take a look at the results. So yeah, it looks like about a third of you felt like, probably things were really already going well before SB 177 came along, and so that's great. Um, but it looks like about 70% of you saying that there has been at least a little bit, if not very much, of a difference caused by SB 177. So that's great to hear. Sometimes it's just kind of another reason to have that excuse to do a training or provide a resource or get the information out there to the people who need it. So I'm glad to see that that has provided some assistance to a lot of you all on the webinar. That's great. All right. I did want to provide some more resources around the issue of immediate enrollment. So again, after the webinar, you will get an email that will have the link to get this presentation, so you don't need to worry about scribbling all these links down right now. But just a few of what I personally feel like are some of the best resources out there. There's a protocol for enrolling unaccompanied youth. Sometimes there are, questions or reservations about, oh, what do we do when a young person comes in, alone to enroll? And I think that enrollment protocol is really good. You can take a look at that. It's also part of a toolkit that has a number of other resources related to unaccompanied youth. So you might want to look at some of those other resources as well. For those school districts who are seeing an increase in unaccompanied immigrant children who are entering from Central America, we've just recently put together a revised brief on that issue that includes some links to some of the information coming out from the federal government, from the Department of Education, and also from the Department of Homeland Security. So you can take a look at that resource. And then again, the National Center for Homeless Education, they have a resource really looking at what are some of the best strategies for enrolling students who come into your school without records? And of course, the best strategy always is for us to get the records, but we know that unfortunately, despite our best technology and best efforts, sometimes it takes longer than we'd like to get those records in. So that brief has some really great strategies for working on that issue. Some of my top immediate enrollment resource list there. Okay, continuing on with SB 177, number 3 was the posting of public notice. Again, you'll see the exact statutory language there on your slide. This is worded a little bit strangely, and I want to explain why. You'll see that it says if a local education agency designates a local educational agency liaison for homeless children and youth, and that section there, 11432, that's a reference to the McKinney-Vento Act. And again, those of you who've been working with the McKinney-Vento Act for a while are probably asking yourself, well, what do you mean if an agency designates a liaison? We have to designate a liaison. And that's absolutely correct. The reason it says if in the state statute is because if ever the McKinney-Vento Act might ever happen to change and there would no longer be a requirement for that liaison, the state law doesn't make that requirement all by itself. But I can say that we don't have any expectation that that aspect of the McKinney-Vento Act is going to change. So you can almost kind of ignore the if there. It's just a strange, legislative wording there. But essentially, this is requiring that public notice of the educational rights of homeless children and youth be disseminated in schools. And again, we'll get on to the next slide here and see that the McKinney-Vento Act really is already saying that for you. So it says again, every LEA is required to designate a liaison under the McKinney-Vento Act, and McKinney-Vento also does require liaisons to ensure that public notice is available in schools and also other places where children and youth receive services. So that can get you now out into the community, into shelters, into soup kitchens. Maybe you have a youth drop-in center, transitional living programs, those motels that you may have in your community where you know there's a high percentage of homeless youth and children and families living in those motels. So really just trying to get that information out widely in the community. I'm very happy to say that California Department of Education already has posters available for you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I'm going to guess that most of you on this call already have those posters, and they're already up in your offices, and they're already up in your communities. But if you need any, you can go ahead and get them right off the website. Or I also noticed that Leanne Wheeler, your California state coordinator for McKinney-Vento, has put her direct phone number and email address right there in the chat box, so you can have her send some to you, or you can go ahead and check them out online. So some other ways to get out public notice in addition to posters. Pretty much every LEA these days, I think, has a website. Getting that information up on the website is a great and easy way to make sure that people who need the information are able to access it. Student handbooks, a lot of times how many of your students are actually reading through the whole student handbook? Probably not that many of them, but it still can be good to have that information there. Having it on enrollment and withdrawal forms, and I know most school districts in California already are using enrollment forms that ask about housing status. So that's a great way also to do identification and also get information out to students and families who need it. Okay, we've got just this one last point on SB 177, and then we'll be able to get into some of your questions. So the last point, which in some ways is the most interesting because it really is going quite a bit beyond the McKinney-Vento Act. And this is the requirement for the California Department of Education and Department of Social Services to convene a work group. This is to be an interagency work group focused on adopting policies and practices to support homeless children and youth and to ensure that abuse and neglect reporting requirements don't create barriers, whether that be to school enrollment or attendance of homeless children and youth. So I think that this work group could result in some pretty exciting policies and practices that could come out that could really assist school districts, and not only school districts, but also county welfare departments and social service agencies in providing appropriate services to homeless children and youth. So let's go to our last poll. The reasoning behind this question and the whole reason why we wanted to have a CDE DSS working group is about the barriers that we have seen where young people hesitate to get involved in services or even to enroll in school because they're worried about either being referred to child welfare, getting their parents in trouble. They're perhaps worried about involving siblings who are still at home with their parents in the child welfare system. So a lot of fear and hesitation around that. So go ahead and take a look at this question. Answer yes or no, and we'll see what those on the call, what your experience has been with this particular barrier for homeless children and youth. Okay, thanks for voting. I can see that most people have voted. We'll give you just a few more seconds to get that final vote in. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll. And so, as you can see, 41% of those of you who are on the call have seen youth hesitate to access services or even to enroll in school because of these concerns about referral to law enforcement or to child welfare. And that's really where this issue for the working group came from, and also where AB 652 came from. And again, I'm not going to give you a preview of the January webinar, but these were issues that were very close to our hearts and minds as we were putting together some of these ideas. So let's take a look then at what the issues have been. So in surveys that NAEHCY has done in several cities around the country, we have found that when we've surveyed homeless youth who are under 18, their fear of being reported to Child Protective Services or to law enforcement was the greatest barrier they cited in terms of accessing services. When we asked them, why don't you go for the help that's out there? That was really the fear and the barrier that they cited more than any other. So we know that immediate school enrollment is required. We don't have any questions about that, but we don't want young people to be in a position where they feel like they have to choose between school or services or safety. And perhaps the other option, which might be being in an unsafe environment or not getting the services they need because of this fear. So that's where the working group comes into play. CDE and DSS, of course, are aware that they have this working group requirement. What we would like to do is get some input from you all about what you think the policies and practices that this working group should consider or should adopt. What do you think would be good things for CDE and DSS to come out with, whether it's implementation guides, whether it's assistance or ideas for how schools and service providers can work together. Perhaps you'd like to see some clearer policies or instruments to help you enroll youth in school and serve youth. So if you come up with your own ideas of what you think would work well and what you would like to see come out of this working group, I'd really like to know. So you're invited to type those right into the chat box right now if you like, or again, in one of the later slides, you'll have my email address. Please drop me an email and let me know what you think, because we can take those ideas and those suggestions and bring them right to the working group, and really encourage them to take a look at them and to adopt them, because of course you all are the ones in the field who are working with homeless children and youth every day, and your ideas are informed, expert ideas that we would really like this working group to consider and to take a look at. So please don't be shy. Please go ahead and let us know what your ideas are. Okay, so I think at this point we can pause. I have noticed quite a few questions coming up in the chat box. So I am going to ask Shahara Hyatt from the California Homeless Youth Project if she would help me navigate these questions and make sure that we're getting your concerns met. Shahara, what do you have for me?
Hi everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Shahara.
Great. Yeah, this is Shahara here. I'm going to be moderating the questions. So the first one comes from Rebecca, and she asks, are these laws required for higher educational institutions? If so, which departments in the higher education are required to implement these laws?
Oh, great question. Thank you. So SB 177 really is focusing on local educational agencies, which would include your school districts, county offices of education, and also charter schools. So it does not apply directly to higher education. However, I wouldn't be surprised at all if this CDE DSS working group that I was just talking about considered what's some of the challenges are for homeless youth who are in higher education, whether that's community colleges or four-year colleges. And I would love it actually if they would take a look at that issue and try to come up with some policies and practices for that community. So right now, no, there's nothing in this law that really is a requirement on higher ed. But if you have ideas for what policies you might like to see, I would certainly love to bring that issue to the attention of that working group. We know that there are a lot of barriers that students who are homeless and trying to go to college are facing.
Great. So our next question comes from Rodrigo. He says, the working group sounds great, but how can it be expanded to include housing authorities?
Oh, that's a great idea. So yeah, Rodrigo. So the only two organizations that are required by SB 177 to participate in the working group are CDE and DSS, but many other organizations can be invited to attend. And so again, I think it would be great for the working group to have housing agencies as part of it, and perhaps other state level or even local level agencies as well. So I will be sure to bring that suggestion to them, because you're right, if we're going to be talking about policies and practices to support homeless youth, even if we're focusing on education, housing is obviously a very important part of educational success for homeless students. So that's a great idea, and I will bring that to them.
So maybe while more questions filter in, I can read off some of the recommendations that people are making around this work group. Does that sound all right?
Sure, yeah.
Great. So Robert suggests providing a list of all services available to homeless children and youth that the Department of Social Services has to offer as one suggestion.
Oh, great. I
Mhm.
think that's a great suggestion. Keep them coming.
Yeah, and Norma mentioned that it would be really helpful for the LEA to have a direct contact at the Department of Social Services.
Ah, okay. Right, since there are McKinney-Vento liaisons at the school district, so anyone who wants to ask a question of a school district about homelessness, they know who their contact is, and it would be great for the LEA to have those sort of companion contacts at other agencies. Absolutely.
Mhm. Norma also mentions there are issues when unaccompanied youth try to enroll in CalFresh and their parents are receiving those benefits for the student. So this doesn't relate to SB 177, but to one of the other bills that we'll probably talk about at a later webinar. But just to continue, in case it's something we can address now, she says some social workers will work on providing family maintenance instead of providing the benefits to the student. So require for LEAs and Department of Social Services to have MOUs in order to refer cases to one another.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's something that we have discussed with some of the CalFresh agencies around the country and also around the state. And so that gets a little bit tricky, because if a youth's on his or her own, of course, has the right to enroll in CalFresh and get those benefits. And what the procedure would be for the parent actually to not get the benefits. So the student would be removed from the parent's CalFresh case and would get those benefits in his or her own name. And that's legally what should happen. But I know that practically speaking, oftentimes youth are unwilling, or at least they're hesitant to try to get CalFresh, because they know that the result will be that their parents' benefit will be reduced, and they're really hesitant to do that, either because they have siblings at home and they know their siblings really need that income so that they can have good nutrition, or just because they know their parents are going to get angry, and they're trying to avoid that kind of conflict. So if you're working with a youth and they are aware of that consequence and they want to go forward with their benefit, that's absolutely their right. And if you run into barriers with that, please do let me know, and we can try to help you with that. But I think it is important to have those conversations so that the young person knows, what the consequences down the line might be.
Okay, so our next question, Stephanie wanted to know, does an LEA have a responsibility to remove transportation barriers within district boundaries?
Yeah, sure, Stephanie. So this is getting probably, I mean, obviously way beyond SB 177, and I don't want to oversimplify it or mislead anyone. But if you take a look at the McKinney-Vento Act, there is a specific requirement that both SEAs and also LEAs do have to remove barriers to homeless students' enrollment and retention in school. And so transportation barriers would be one of those barriers. Now, there's a couple of other transportation requirements in McKinney-Vento as well, and those of you on the call who are familiar with McKinney-Vento, I'm sure know about them. The one that most people know about is the requirement to provide transportation to the school of origin. So your question kind of has a couple of different answers. One is, you may have a school of origin that's within the district boundaries. It's not within the attendance zone, but within the district zone. And so school of origin transportation absolutely would be required. But even if it's not the school of origin, there is a responsibility to remove barriers. And that doesn't necessarily mean providing a bus or providing a cab or that sort of thing. But it does mean addressing the barriers so that the child can attend school. And so if you want to talk in more detail about that, you're welcome to contact me directly, or you can go ahead and contact Leanne Wheeler again at the California Department of Education, and she can give you some more specifics on that question.
So Lucy says, our charter school has a maximum capacity allowed by the school district in the charter. If our school is at maximum capacity, are we also required to immediately admit homeless children?
Thanks for that question, Lucy, because that's a confusing one, I think, for a lot of folks when there are class size limitations or capacity limitations. So the immediate enrollment requirement, let me see if I can kind of quickly get back up to that slide without taking too much time here. Basically, what it says is, it requires immediate enrollment. Here we go. Got it. It requires immediate enrollment in any public school that children living in the same attendance area are eligible to attend. So in your example, if a student were a house student and had their own home, very stably housed, and they wanted to enroll in your charter school, it sounds like what you're saying is they would not be able to enroll in the charter school because the capacity limit is already reached. So that means that another child living in the same area where this homeless child is living would not be eligible to attend your school. So if that's the case, then that would mean that a homeless child living in the same area also would not be eligible. It's a little bit of a comparability in terms of eligibility. The immediate enrollment is looking more at things like lack of immunizations, lack of proof of residency, lack of school records, lack of guardianship, mostly those paperwork requirements that get in the way. The only important caveat that I'd want to note for schools like charter schools and magnet schools and other schools that oftentimes have an application process, and sometimes, for example, the deadline for that application process is in March for the school year that starts in the fall. And a student, because of their homelessness, might not even arrive in the attendance area or in the district until April or maybe even August. And so they've missed that deadline because of their homelessness, because of their mobility. For those kinds of things, that's really a barrier that's related to homelessness. And so we would ask the charter school or the magnet school or whoever else to waive that barrier. Now, if you're already at capacity, you're already at capacity, and there's really nothing we can do about that. But if you have space available and the issue is just that the student missed the deadline, then McKinney-Vento would say, well, that's a barrier caused by homelessness. So let's address that barrier by letting them go ahead and apply or enroll now.
Okay, great. So the next question, also from Rodrigo, can the working group begin to develop a needs assessment template that districts can use when they enroll or identify homeless youth? For example, types of services available, etc.
Yeah, keep the questions coming, Rodrigo. That's great. So again, I think that's a terrific idea, and it would be probably pretty interesting if it could be a template that could be used not only on the school side, but perhaps by other agencies as well. And I will definitely speak with Leanne Wheeler about that, because there might even be such a template already in existence that I'm not aware of. I know I've seen them in other school districts and in other states, so there may even be one in California that I don't know about. And if that's the case, we'll be sure to follow up with everyone and either get that document to you or get you a link to it or whatever. But if there isn't one in existence, I think that's a terrific idea and something very tangible that we could ask the working group to work on.
Okay, so I'll just take a moment to invite folks to keep submitting any questions or recommendations for the DSS and Department of Ed work group.
Thanks,
Looks like
Shahara.
we're all caught up for the moment. Yeah.
That's great. I did kind of scroll up really quickly, and I noticed one question that was only sent to me, so you can't see it. So I can go ahead and address it. And if folks have other questions, please do make sure you're sending them to the entire audience, or else Shahara's not ignoring you. She just can't see your question. But the one that I see, it came in from Molly, and the question is, how does the TDAP requirement for students impact immediate enrollment for homeless youth? For instance, if homeless youth do not have this when they're enrolling. And so immediate enrollment would still apply. So the student would need to be enrolled immediately. And then if there are immunizations or any kind of health procedure that's necessary under the state law or under health requirements, we would want to get that addressed as soon as possible after enrollment. What the U.S. Department of Education says about these different requirements is that if there is some kind of an outbreak happening in your school district or some kind of an issue where you would be taking special precautions in general for all of your students because of a specific kind of illness or outbreak that's happening in your local community, well, you would certainly want to take those same precautions for homeless students. But as a matter of course, the enrollment for all of these different issues would be immediate, and then we'd get the health issues taken care of as soon as possible after that.
So Hillary made a recommendation for the work group and said that it would be helpful if a letter was sent to all LEAs and social service agencies asking them to send out communication to staff that homelessness is not a reason to report to law enforcement, to remove some of the educational barriers.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Hillary. That's another one of those situations where, if we've got it in in the code, but nobody knows what the code says, then the code's not so effective. So yeah, I think some kind of a letter or memo going out, and particularly if it could be joint, so that it would be going out, for example, from CDE and DSS going out to LEAs and social service agencies, as you suggested. I think that's a great idea, and that's another suggestion that we absolutely will bring to them.
So Rodrigo, looks like Leanne has answered your question about some kind of assessment template. So there's a student questionnaire on the Homeless Education webpage entitled Student Services Questionnaire, and the link to that is in the chat box, so you can all find it there.
Thanks, Leanne. And maybe, Rodrigo's question brought up a really good point, which is that, if some folks aren't aware of that, it kind of gets back to Hillary's point as well. Maybe we could suggest that the working group send out a letter highlighting some of these really important resources that are out there, but that maybe not everybody knows about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Lucy asks, this is a question about AB 1733, but does the free birth certificate for homeless children extend to the parents of the homeless child who are U.S. citizens?
Yeah, I can answer that briefly, and I definitely would encourage you all to take a look at AB 1733. An organization called Housing California was the organization that was really behind pushing that and getting that passed. But just to answer Lucy's question, that particular bill actually applies to any homeless person in the state. So it's not just children and youth. There's no, upper or lower age limit on it. So it would apply, in your question, I'm sort of assuming that the parents of the homeless child also are homeless themselves. And so in that case, yeah, they would be eligible for that free birth certificate.
Great. Once again, it looks like we're caught up at the moment.
All right. Well, I will click forward to my last slide, and that'll give people just a few more seconds to type in any lingering questions.
Okay, and also want to say that Leanne just posted, please remind everyone that they can join the Homeless Education listserv via that same link that she posted on their webpage. So this is a really great resource to find out about, laws that are being passed and other resources for liaisons.
That's a great reminder. Yeah, thanks, you guys. That is a terrific resource, and I'm on it, and it's one of those listservs that I really love because Leanne doesn't send out 20 emails a day and clog up my inbox. It's really just the important things that come out on it. It's a really great resource. All right, well, since it seems like maybe we have gotten to all of your questions, let me get to a few more housekeeping details. So when we sign off of the webinar, you will have an evaluation that'll pop up in your browser. I think it's 4 questions. So if you're able to take just 1 minute to fill out that evaluation for us, that'll really help us make sure that we're giving you the webinar content that is most useful to you. You also, as I've mentioned, will get a follow-up email. It'll have a link to download this PowerPoint presentation, and it will also provide, again, the dates and the links to sign up for the remaining 3 webinars in this series that will take place in January, March, and May. We would like to invite you to like us on Facebook. That's where we put out all of our late-breaking news, things that are going on in Congress, things in the media about homelessness. So if you use Facebook, you can look us up. You can also look up the California Homeless Youth Project, and you can follow us both on Twitter. And there are our Twitter handles right there on your slide. So if you happen to use Twitter, you can get all of our latest news that way. And that is really the end of what I had to say to you today. So even though we're a little bit under time, I'm proud of myself for being under time instead of overtime. And I appreciate all of your great questions. I really appreciate the suggestions that you sent in for the working group. And please, again, do feel free to send more suggestions and more ideas. If your colleagues have ideas, go ahead and email those to me, and we will bring those to the working group. You have my word on that. We'll make sure that gets to the folks who need to have it. So once again, thank you all very much. With that, you have my contact information. You have Shahara's contact information there on that last slide. Once again, I thank you for your participation, and I will go ahead and end the